Dear Levi, pages 94 through 101. Dear Levi, I hope you are well. I was sick with fever for 3 days and so could not celebrate the fact that we had almost reached the shores of the Columbia, but I'm feeling better today. Charlotte was also sick, though Lucy and Mattie are well. I try to visit with them very often as they have become orphans like me, and I think of them as sisters. Frank's family had a bad accident yesterday. Their lead mule, Ned, spooked by something on the side of the road, shied suddenly to the right. He turned so short that Mr. Hickman had no time to stop him, and crack, 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 away went the tongue of their wagon. It was nearly broken off, but fortunately in long splinters. Frank's paw set to cussing and then drew his revolver. "This'll teach you," he snarled, and put a ball through one of Ned's thighs. The poor mule danced around in pain before settling down. It took near an hour to fix the wagon's tongue, since the other men on the train seemed reluctant to offer their help, even Mr. Hickman's brother-in-law, Mr. Cantrell. But everyone knew that the sooner the tongue was repaired, the sooner we could all move on, so Mr. Cantrell and a number of others finally did come forward. Frank's face went all red, as it always does when his father draws attention to himself. We stood around watching them cut some rawhide strips to tie up the broken pieces, when Ned suddenly lets loose with both hind feet as Mr. Hickman draws near. There was a loud whoosh of air as Frank's paw was struck in the chest. He fell over backward with his hat falling off his head. When he stood back up, I knew he was aiming to kill Ned, and I guess Ned knew it too, 'cause as soon as Mr. Hickman came at him with his revolver again, the mule turned and with its left hind leg kicked Mr. Hickman in the side of the head. When Frank's paw fell this time, he didn't get back up. They carried him to his wagon, and Reuben did what he could, though he thought a doctor was needed. Mr. Cantrell rode out to the train ahead where a doctor is traveling, and in a short time the man arrived to attend to him. I told Reuben how surprised I was to see Frank so worried since his pa was such a bad man. Reuben said that the folks are never just good or bad, and most times they've got some good and bad mixed up in them, though he supposed Mr. Hickman had more bad than good. He also said blood is thicker than water, and that as mean as Frank's pa was to him, he was the only pa Frank had. We finally moved out today, with Mr. Hickman still taken to his bed in his wagon. He came down with the fever last night, so the doctor rode over late this afternoon and bled him, but Frank says he doesn't seem much improved. Neither Hiram nor I really wanted to do it, but for Frank we knew we should, so we both decided on including Mr. Hickman in our prayers. Your brother Austin. Dear Levi, Frank's pa died this morning. There was a heavy frost on the ground, and it took the men a while to dig the grave. Mrs. Hickman did not shed a tear as she watched the men making a coffin out of wagon pieces found on the road. Frank stayed near his mother and would not come near Hiram or me. Mr. Cantrell, Mrs. Hickman's brother, will help them to finish the journey, and Frank's older brother Ben will do most of the driving. We got a late start on account of the burial and only made 10 miles. There are a great many evergreen trees here, fir and pine, and it looks very much like the green of Pennsylvania. I saw a fine hummingbird with a brilliant scarlet red head and body of bright yellow, with the outer half of its wings being scarlet too. A number of snake warriors galloped near to us, but then rode off. They were wearing feathered headdresses, and had handsome horses with red blankets. They seemed very fine indeed. We passed near the Indian lodges, where there was a large grove of service berries. Many of the ripe berries had been picked and dried, and the squaws were offering to trade a half bushel of the fruit for a darning needle. Reuben said he had a good recipe for berry cobbler, but when he looked behind the Indians he found that the berries had been laid to draw on the flesh sides of green deerskins spread on the ground. There were flies, dirt, and dogs all gathering about, and so we decided against the berry cobbler that night. We saw a flock of wild geese at a nearby stream, and Reuben is determined to bring one back for dinner today. I almost went with him, but then decided to work on my slingshot with Frank instead. Seeing how we've become Hiram's protectors, and he has the bad habit of shooting his mouth off to any bully that crosses his path, we thought it best to arm ourselves. It is getting darker as I write this by the fire, and I wonder where Reuben has got to, as he usually returns before dark. Sometimes it's hard to imagine how far we've come and how far away you are, Levi. I try not to dwell on that too much, but rather on the day that we'll be able to be together again, living on Pa's claim. I hope you haven't forgotten me too much. Your brother Austin. Dear Levi, it seems every time I settle in with someone, it all goes bad. Reuben did not return to camp last night. Mr. Hart is very worried, as it is most unlike Reuben to stay out overnight. Early this morning a number of cattle were riled up, and 2 mules had taken off. Mr. Hart suspects a panther, as one was spotted yesterday. All I can think of is Reuben meeting up with such a beast. I know he is quick with his gun, but I wonder how quick one must be to survive a panther's attack. There was also word that this morning from the train ahead of us that a scalp had been found pinned to a tree with an arrow through it. Mr. Hart did not think this could be the work of Indians in these parts, as they are not known to take scalps. No one seems to know who took the scalp or whose head it came from. They did not say what color the scalp was, and Hiram says that's a good sign. Since Reuben's hair is so red, they surely would have mentioned the color. I am not so sure. As we waited for the search party to return, Frank suggested we pick up some wild garlic behind the wagons. Reuben can use it when he fixes that goose he's bringing back, he said. Hiram was quick to agree, but I didn't say anything. I was thinking about the time Reuben and I talked about life and how nothing stays the same and how the wind is always fixing to change course. As sad as I was on receiving bad news, I wasn't near prepared enough for what happened next. Hiram's ma was scrubbing some things in a bucket back of their wagon when she lets out a holler. By the time Hiram, Frank, and I reached her, she looked as if she'd seen a ghost. She didn't say a word, just pointed to a hill close to our train. There I saw 3 Indians on horseback. 2 were dressed in skins of some sort, but it was the third that stopped my heart, for he was wearing Reuben's button coat. When Mr. Buckner called to them, the Indians took off. Mr. Hart said that it might prove too dangerous to send a party after them. I heard him tell Mr. Yardley that he sorely regretted having to lead the train, or he'd go after the Indians himself. Everyone is very sad, but none sadder than me, I think. Tonight I was asleep in the wagon alone, just me and old Bill. I wish the wind would calm down for a while and stop changing its course. I'm feeling chilled to the bone. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, pages 102 through 109. Dear Levi, I'm so glad to write you about the events of this morning. I had slept poorly and was up early when I heard a ruckus coming from outside the wagon. I pulled back the flap, and who should be standing with his back to me but an Indian warrior in full feathered headdress. I let out a holler so loud that I woke up most of the train. The Indian spun around with a goose in his hand, and my mouth dropped open, for I could see that this Indian had a red beard. And then I realized that it wasn't an Indian at all. It was Reuben. By this time, folks were coming out of their wagons and gathering around us. Everyone was talking and laughing, and much to my relief, to see that Reuben was alive. When everyone calmed down and had enough of touching his headdress, Reuben started in to tell us what had happened. Just before sundown yesterday, he had shot himself a fat goose. He was heading back to camp when his mule Chester fell into a badger's hole. He had a hard time getting him out, as the mule's leg was twisted pretty bad. Reuben knew if he tried to force the mule back to camp on a bad leg, he'd probably lame him for good. So he wrapped the leg in some dock leaves and settled in to spend the night, hoping that by morning Chester would be improved. After making a fire to warm himself, Reuben set about plucking his goose, when he heard some branches breaking behind him. That's when the 3 Cayuse Indians appeared. They had just come from some big powwow, and Reuben deduced at once that the one wearing a splendid headdress was a chief. Reuben could see that this chief was very proud and strong, but he seemed friendly enough. When the chief offered to trade his headdress for the coat, Reuben knew better than to refuse. It was plain they fancied my red hair almost as much as my coat, so I thought it best to give up the coat and with luck keep my scalp. I suppose that chief was under the impression that I was some great chief myself, what with having such a coat. He was most respectful in making the transaction, and seemed quite satisfied as he mounted his pony. I declare it was mighty hard to see my old coat with all its years of buttons go riding off on that Indian's back, though I reckon he's as respectful of its worth as I could hope for. Frank, Hiram, and I all took turns trying on the headdress, which has all kinds of feathers, in many colors, and a band of very fine beadwork. Later that night we enjoyed a feast of roast goose, and Reuben noted that the flavor was much improved by the fresh garlic. As we were clearing up, I told Reuben how worried I'd been. He said I worried too much and that it wasn't good for my constitution. Then I asked him if he would get another coat, so that he could collect more buttons on his travels. I suppose I'm growing weary of my traveling and making camp every night, Reuben replied. I was thinking I might try settling down for a spell. I took a deep breath before asking him if he would settle in Oregon, and he said he thought he would. So this new coat could be your Oregon coat, I suggested. He smiled at that, and I said, I suppose so. That's all he would say on the subject, but it was enough to make me feel a whole lot easier about finding my way out there. At least I know I have a friend in Reuben. I can hardly believe that in 2 weeks' time I'll be looking out over Pa's beautiful acres. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, we are camped very close to the Columbia River. Last night we had a dinner of fried salmon. There are many Indians camped around us selling these fish to the trains. We crossed the Fall, or Deschutes River, as it is called here. The wagons were ferried across at $2 a wagon, and we swam the stock. I wish you could see me in the water now. I am so accustomed to it that Hiram and I had to swim just for fun after the crossing. Charlotte has taken to following us everywhere, and we gave her a ride on our backs. Frank's ma's clean out of money and had to sell this sorrel mare, Nell, to finish the trip. It's hard to believe that we have really reached our destination. As happy as we are, Frank and Hiram and I suddenly realized that in a short time we would have to be parting company, for we are within 2 days' drive of Pa's claim. Frank and Hiram will be traveling farther along with a group of others to far northwest, just outside of Fort Vancouver. We have decided to become blood brothers. It was Hiram's idea. He said once we become blood brothers, we can never be separated by land or sea because we'd always be united by blood. His older brother Thomas had already done it and told him how to go about it. So we went back to the wagons and found some thorny bushes, and after pulling off a sharp thorn, we pricked our fingers. Then we took turns pressing our bloodied fingers together. We swore to be secret blood brothers until the day we died. Hiram thought it would be a good idea to leave a blood print on our foreheads, so we stuck ourselves again and did that. It didn't hurt the first time, but the second time it did. When we returned to camp, a lot of the other boys were curious about our marked foreheads, but we told them we couldn't say anything about it, as we were sworn to secrecy. I'm only telling you 'cause you're blood already. And then we went to talk to Reuben and decided that he should be let in on it, and he had exchanged buttons with us all. Reuben was impressed and said that having a blood brother was truly a noble thing. He offered us each a sip of elderberry wine to mark the occasion. We also got to look through his collection of bird feathers, and we each got to choose one. Frank chose a red-winged blackbird feather. Hiram wanted the feather from a hawk, and I decided on a fine white seagull feather that Reuben found on the beach of the Atlantic Ocean. I'm saving it for you. We stayed up late that night talking about our feathers and the birds they came from, and Reuben made up a great tale about a blackbird, hawk, and seagull who become friends. It was exciting and funny, and we liked it on account of its having such a happy ending. I'm glad to have reached Pa's beautiful Oregon at last, but I will surely miss the good friends I have made along the way. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, it's been pouring rain for the last 2 days, and we are stuck waiting here for it to let up. Seems so much harder to wait now after coming so far, but there's nothing else to be done. I hope you are well and wonder what games you must be playing and who you're playing with. I wish I could introduce you to Frank and Hiram before we all split up. I know you would like them as much as I do. I am not good at this infernal waiting, and think I might try counting raindrops to pass the time. Your brother, Austin. Dear Austin, pages 110 to 119. Dear Levi, pages 110 through 119. Dear Levi, finally the rain has let up, and so much has happened I hardly know where to begin. We crossed the Columbia River yesterday. The Cantrells had a new baby daughter, coming just before we crossed. They named her Columbia. Frank's mother has decided to settle up north with the Cantrells, though they are camping here for another day. Since Hiram's pa was so low on money, he traded 2 yoke of oxen for a half section of land with 1/2 acre planted to potatoes and a small cabin and lean-to with no windows. It is close enough to town and the river to make it a good location. This is where Charlotte and Lucy will live also. I wish the Buckners could take me in with them, but they have 8 children now with the girls, and there's hardly enough room for them all. Reuben has offered to help me find out about Pa's claim, and tomorrow we will go to the lumber camp and look for Mr. Zykes. Everything seems to happen very fast. This land is as beautiful as Pa said. The trees are blue-green and seem to rise up hundreds of feet into the sky. I am eager to set eyes on Pa's claim and to step on the ground that he got for us. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, I visited Pa's grave today. It was out on a hill behind the lumber camp. There was a small stone marker that had heaved with the frost and was almost falling over. On it was the inscription, Matthew Ives, aged 34, died of the fever, February 22nd, 1851. It was hard to look at that marker and think of our Pa buried beneath it. Reuben helped me to write the stone and set it back into the ground. I am sorry to have to write you that Mr. Zykes was not the friend Pa thought him to be. At the lumber camp we learned that right after Pa died, Mr. Zykes sold Pa's claim to the lumber company and took off with the money to California. The man working in the company office said we could probably buy it back, but it would have to be at a profit. Seeing how we have no money, I supposed Pa's land would be lost to us for good. It was hard to school my anger at Mr. Zykes for having stole us, the only thing Pa left in this world, and anger at Pa for having trusted such a scoundrel in the first place. As I walked out to the porch of the main building, Reuben followed me. I told him that I wished Pa had never come out here, that he should have thought of us and what would happen to us if he was killed. That's when Reuben shook his head and said it was no good wishing for things to change that could never be changed. He said that Pa was thinking of us, and I should never forget that. Then he went back inside for a while, and I waited on the porch, stewing over all that had gone wrong. When he came back out, Reuben didn't say anything. He just stepped off the porch and began to untie his mule. I followed him and untied mine, and together we headed back to camp. I was feeling so poorly by now that I hardly noticed we had taken a different path, and it wasn't long before Reuben brought Chester to a halt. When I asked him why we were stopping here, he stretched out his arm and said, "To have a look." I wasn't inclined to have a look at anything, but when I finally did look out, I had to admit that it was a beautiful sight. There was a clearing surrounded by great stands of evergreens, pine and fir and hemlock. "That's a mighty pretty piece of property you've got yourself," Reuben said. "What are you talking about, Reuben?" I asked. "Talking about your pa's claim," he replied, pointing to the lake before us. 600 acres, including the lake there. And that's when he told me what he had done. He had informed the man at the lumber company that he was prepared to buy back Pa's claim. "And this is it?" I gasped. Reuben smiled and nodded. I couldn't believe my eyes. You'd have to imagine the prettiest piece of land in the States, and then imagine it 100 times prettier. That's what our claim is like. There is a stillness to these woods that runs deep, broken only by the press of the wind through the trees. There is a small lake stretching like so much glass laced with hemlock and fir. The air is pure and fresh with the scent of green wood, and the soil is rich and black. It is all Pa said it was, and it is ours. The best part is that Reuben's taking on living rights. Says he and old Bill could do the rest from the road. He's planning to cook from the lumber camp, and I'll be his assistant. What do you say if we build us a cabin next spring? I'll do the cooking and you do the worrying. I was just about speechless by this time, and it was all I could do to sputter. I could never worry as good as you cook, Reuben, but I sure would like to try. Of course, we'll need that brother of yours to help with the work, so you best write him and see about his traveling out next April, Reuben said with a grin. All is very well. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, said goodbye to Frank today as he and his family headed up north. Hiram gave him back his fossil rock. Frank and I exchanged lava rocks. Then we all three shook hands and pledged to remain brothers till our dying days. It was a sad parting, as we knew we might never see Frank again. As for Hiram, Charlotte, and Lucy, they are to be my neighbors, for our claim is only some 6 miles north of their cabin. Mattie is settling with the Yardleys, who were looking for a claim nearby. This morning, as we packed up the wagon, I asked Reuben about the money for the land. It had been on my mind since I knew he was not a wealthy man. Reuben explained how he had come into some riches several years ago, but that he had found no good use for it till now. When I asked if the money was in a bank, he snorted and said he'd never trust his nuggets to a bank. That's when he went over to old Bill and turned him over. Then he pulled out a string, and before I knew it, he was unlacing old Bill's stomach. And what do I find? But that old Bill's stuffed with rocks, all right. He's stuffed with rocks of gold. This afternoon we'll ride over our land and decide on where to situate the cabin. The rain has cleared out, and Reuben said we might see a rainbow later on. Already see one, I replied. Your brother, Austin.